Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, China has confirmed an upcoming state visit by U.S. President Donald Trump. China's exports and imports set records in April despite high energy costs. Trump calls Iran's response to peace plan totally unacceptable. And Keir Starmer's Labour Party lost big in Britain's local elections. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, China says U.S. President Donald Trump will pay a state visit to the country between Wednesday and Friday. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs says President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump will exchange views on bilateral ties and major issues concerning global peace and development. The ministry also says China is willing to work with the U.S. to expand cooperation, handle disputes, and inject more stability into a world riddled with changes and turbulence. In the meantime, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng is going to lead a delegation to South Korea between Tuesday and Wednesday for economic and trade consultation with the United States. China's Ministry of Commerce says the two sides is going to follow the important consensus reached by the two heads of state during their meeting in Busan, South Korea, and previous phone conversations. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations with East China Normal University. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Mahoney. It will be the first visit to China by a U.S. president in almost 9 years. Compared to the time when President Trump made his 2017 China visit during his first term in office, in what ways do you think the relationship between China and the United States look different today?
Well, I think one of the things that all of us realize, because the whole world experienced this tremendous event of COVID, the pandemic, and I think a lot of our memories are sort of strange when we try to look back through the veil of that time, because so much in the world has changed since then in terms of China's continued rise, and I think what many perceive is the continued struggles of the United States, and certainly the China-U.S. relationship has shifted dramatically since that 2017 state visit. Plus, today ties are much more adversarial and structurally competitive. We can look, for example, in trade. In 2017, the focus was on a $250 billion business deal signing. Now, after a 2025 tariff war that pushed U.S. rates on Chinese goods to 145%, and saw bilateral trade drop 14.4%. Both sides are operating under fragile negotiated guardrails that are creating challenges for both, continuing challenges, as well as creating risks for both, as well as the global economy. If we look at technology, we see technology competition has intensified from a concern into a defining battlefield. The U.S. now weaponizes chip export controls and warns against Chinese semiconductors globally, while China is able to counter this with rare earth export controls. And this makes the 2017 cooperation on market access feel rather distant. We've certainly seen a change in diplomatic tone. Ceremonial warmth has cooled. We don't see or anticipate Beijing will replicate 2017's lavish staging, I think reflecting some of the tense underlying dynamics, including China's ties to Iran and Venezuela, and hardened mutual suspicion. And finally, I think we to continue with this theme of a structural shift, the relationship has moved from what we might call engagement with competition to competition with managed coexistence, with both sides learning that maximum pressure triggers retaliation rather than capitulation.
Some say the Iran conflict, the Taiwan question, artificial intelligence, nuclear weapons, and critical minerals will be high on the agenda when the top leaders of China and the United States meet in Beijing for talks. What is your observation, Professor?
Absolutely. All of these are likely topics of discussion and possibly, U.S. support for Japanese militarization. Of course, we've already mentioned trade and lingering trade disputes across the board. These will certainly be things that'll be front and center. With China now producing a new class of chips that will render the U.S. Tech blockade less and less significant, while also diminishing the previous political leverage and dominant global market share enjoyed by Western chip makers, we might see a shift in the U.S. tech blockade tactics because they're really working against U.S. interest at this point. Something that I'm very concerned about is the decision to put U.S. hypersonic Dark Eagle missiles under U.S. STRATCOM command. This is another provocation that needs to be addressed, as well as broader concerns related to nuclear weapons. The U.S., of course, is deeply concerned about China's ability to accelerate de-dollarization and China's continued ability to impose rare earth export controls. Now, there is a Chinese idiom that I think really fits this meeting probably more than any other idiom, and that is, you have your policy, I have my policy. And this, I think, indicates the sort of tactical stalemate both sides have reached. Now we can see that this creates an opening for more resolutions or more entrenchments, whether or not they're going to find some way to sort of make a temporary peace with some modest relaxation, or whether or not they'll further entrench and seek new efforts to create breakouts and flanking maneuvers.
How do you think we should expect with regard to what may get accomplished during the U.S. president's visit?
First, and unfortunately, it needs to be said, if we can avoid unnecessary grandstanding or provocative gestures by the U.S. side before, during, or immediately after the meeting, that would already be a substantial accomplishment. Second, I think Trump needs to, I think he faces a tremendous amount of pressure to resolve inflationary pressures faced by U.S. consumers, voters, some of which is being driven by the still high tariffs his administration imposed against China. And he might also need help with an exit strategy given the strategic pickle he's created in Iran, and maybe China could help there. Which is also driving energy inflation, not just in the U.S., which is hitting U.S. consumers who still depend very much on petrol, who haven't really made that dramatic shift to EVs like we've seen in China, and certainly that's something that would be really hitting them hard in the summer months that are already coming. In fact, if you understand the U.S. Schedule, kids are starting to finish school, and this is when families start driving and taking trips. This is when they start flying and taking trips. If you have high petrol or fuel prices, it puts a real pressure on families, and that makes them unhappy when they go to the ballot box. Now, these two forms of inflation are certainly undermining Republican prospects for the midterms later this year. Of course, he might already consider losing Republican control of Congress fait accompli, and not just because of all the things that have happened that have made voters unhappy, but given the usual pattern, presidents losing control during midterms when they enter office with their party controlling both houses. So he might not care whether or not Republicans lose control because he's not really working with congressional Republicans anyway, but largely ruling through executive orders. In other words, he might not care about political risks and might be driven by other strategic calculations. So it's difficult to say presently whether we'll see him embracing a broader trade deal, which he could exploit for popularity, which could help voters with inflationary pressures, or whether we'll see modest gains that keep relations managed but still fraught because perhaps he has some broader strategic objective vis-a-vis China that he still wants to push forward. Now, third, I think we'll see China being a diplomatic host, but not as warm as it was in 2017. The U.S. has attacked two of China's strategic allies, Iran and Venezuela, actions many view as indirect attacks on China. At the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some sort of positive breakthrough related to Iran following the meeting. And if so, that would certainly be something many in the world would welcome.
What do you make of the consensus reached by President Xi Jinping and President Trump during their meeting last year and previous phone talks And with those consensus serving as the guiding principle, how does the prospect of the China-U.S. trade consultation in South Korea look like?
Well, let's be clear that trade consultation in South Korea will be taking place on May 12th and 13th, just
Yeah.
ahead of the meetings in Beijing between the two presidents. So I think that this we should take sort of a cautiously constructive outlook, and certainly this is informed by the consensus that was reached previously by President Xi and President Trump. Now, I think the talks are framed as preparation for Trump's state visit, suggesting both sides view them as groundwork rather than confrontation. The involvement of top economic officials. This signals serious intent and enough pre-negotiated substance to justify this sort of high-level engagement in Korea just ahead of the summit in Beijing. Now, discussions likely will focus on economic and trade issues of mutual concern, drawing from the Busan summit consensus and prior phone calls. Now, Bissen has framed economic security as national security, indicating the U.S. will continue to push Trump's American first agenda, but also seeking manageable guardrails, because you can't really have national security if things are capable of sliding sideways quickly. So I think it's clear that, I think it's likely that deep structural tensions will persist. Certainly tariff rates remain historically high, and technology competition is for the moment entrenched. But again, the sequencing, in other words, working level talks before a summit, suggests both sides are prioritizing stabilization over escalation. Progress will probably be incremental, focusing on de-escalation mechanisms rather than a comprehensive resolution.
Thank you very much for joining us. Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Political Science and International Relations, joining us from East China Normal University. This is World Today. Stay tuned. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China's foreign trade has maintained strong momentum in April. Trade volumes hit 635 billion US dollars in the month, up by more than 14% from a year earlier. Exports rose nearly 10%, while imports of goods surged by 20.6%. In the first 4 months of this year, China's total foreign trade volume grew by nearly 15%. Mechanical and electrical products accounted for over 60% of China's total exports during this period. Meanwhile, China's consumer prices ticked up by 1.2% in April. The producer price index dropped by 2.8% from a year ago, the highest since July 2022. So for more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang earlier spoke with Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation.
So, Dr. Zhou Mi, thank you very much for joining us. China's foreign trade grew 14.9% in the first 4 months of this year. So what supported China's robust trade performance, do you think? And how are Chinese exporters adapting to the changing world?
Well, I think that the word you are using, adapting, is very important, because Chinese exporters are not just trying to make decisions by themselves. They are trying to look at what the world really needs from us. So this is what has happened, for many years. Chinese exporters are so curious and so sensitive about the change of the world, like for some of the reconstruction of the global supply chains. Many countries are worrying about the sustainable supply of certain products. Well, Chinese exporters are trying to meet their demand, and for another kind of new circumstances, like the uncertainties on the fossil fuel supply. So Chinese companies are really exporting so many new energy generation products and equipment to them. So this is a really important word for us to adapt to the change of the world demands in the different ways. But I want to say more, because China is one of the largest economies in the world, and we are very good at manufacturing. So there are so many different supply chains in China. They can supply some similar products, but in the different function and different segment of the market. So the competition between Chinese exporters are really giving more choices for our trading partners. And I think that is also one of the main reasons why China's export performance is so good compared with most of these main economies in the world.
And you mentioned the trading partners, and China's foreign trade diversification continues to gain momentum. And in the first 4 months of this year, its trade with ASEAN countries up nearly 16%, while the trade with Belt and Road partner countries up 13.5%. So how do you see China's positioning itself to become more resilient to future trade shocks?
Well, it's true that as we discussed, that China is one of the main manufacturings in the world, but we are not just doing everything by ourselves. We have to import the energy, some of the raw materials from the rest of the world. So as one of the main partners in the global supply chains, we are able to deal with these raw materials and transfer the raw materials into the intermediate products, into the final products. So the position are really linked with our trading partners. As one of the the ways that we are dealing with the uncertainties, Chinese government are really curious about improving the trade relations with our trading partners, like to negotiate the free trade agreements and also trying to fulfill our commitments under the WTO mechanism and trying to assure that trade facilitation will be the trend with most of our trading partners. And on the other hand, I would say that China's logistic suppliers are really working very hard. They are expanding their networks to covering most of these trading partners. You know that we have the trade relations with more than 200 economies in the world. That is really huge. So for us, we can adapt to the new change of the energy supplies, and some of the enterprises are trying to do more to use the green energy for the fuels for the ships. So these are really what we are able to do. We are providing choices, and we are also trying to maintain the capacity together with demand. I think that's a collaboration between these two sides are really important for us to have a sustainable and resilient development in the future, maybe possible future trade shocks.
Mhm. And looking at export categories, mechanical and electrical products accounted for over 60% of total exports. And there is also notable growth in green and low carbon products. So what does it say about China's role in the global supply chain?
Yes, that is a really prominent characteristic for China's exports. We are trying to create a new and more innovative space for the collaboration. As trade is only one reflection about the real demand of the economy development and also the industry's development. So these new elements are really giving the world more abilities to deal with these uncertainties. And for the climate change, most of the economies in the world have the promises that we want to reduce carbon emission and we want to keep our economy's growth in the green way. So they are not just trying to do that by themselves. They can count on the global trade, especially from China. That is one very important reason why Chinese companies are really good at these green energy products, and also the EV as one of the very important parts. And the second, I think that for the intelligent economies, like for the digital economy, is really promising. And we can find that in many countries, AI has becoming one of the main forces for the development. And China's companies are really good at that, not only for the products, but also for the services, for the solutions. So all combined are really giving China's foreign trade some very new and special characteristic compared with other countries in the world. I think this is really the world looking for. They really want some input from China and be able to deal with the new areas of the intelligence or technology development. So China's companies are really creating more and more space for the development of the economy.
And China's imports grew by more than 20% in April. So what do you think are the main reasons for that? And how do you see this growth as the global trade growth is projected to be slower this year?
Well, I think that this digit is really are outstanding compared with many years performance. I think the main reason is not just come from China. The main reason is come from United States from this protectionism. After last years, also in the April, the United States has used the so-called reciprocal tariffs to try to publish all the trading partners. Well, at the same time, China keep on opening. We are lowering our tariffs. We are opening our market, and we are providing so many certainty. So in this regard, many countries are trying to rethink about the balance between China and the United States as a trading partner, and they found that it's naturally for them to choose China as one of the main trading partners. So, in the past 1 year, all the global supply chains are reconstructed a lot. Maybe in the past, they also are under some change, but this year is especially prominent for the changes. So we are saying that China is trying to give the very big certainty to the world, and many countries are able to deal with the uncertainties that come from the United States. Maybe they have to also, yield or trying to give some preference treatment to U.S. goods, but they do not have to worry about the relations with China. So in this regard, I think that China is becoming one of the important partner in the or the trade hub for the global trade networks.
And China's zero tariff treatment for African countries starts May the 1st. So what's the biggest difference between the implementation of this latest policy and the previous preferential measures?
Before the May the 1st, China already have the treatment of the zero tariff from many of the African countries for the least developed economies. But this time we cover all the countries in Africa that we have established the diplomatic relations. I think that's the first difference is that we're covering more economies and countries in that continent. And some of them are developing countries, not the least developed country. I think that integration has made it possible for not just those countries to export to China, but also for them to do more integration among themselves, this intra-regional trade between them. And the second, the difference is that, we're not just providing the zero tariff treatment for them. We are also providing some solutions for their capacity building. And I think that many countries, they are really want to explore the market in China, but they do not know about the requirement of the China's customs and also the market access administrations. So we help them to improve their abilities for export to China. And in this regard, they will be also able to deal with, export to many other countries, not only for China. They are improving their abilities to be involved in the global value chains. I think that is really important. So based on this new treatment, I think that many African countries, they can think of not just expanding their export to China, but also trying to improve their, in the country sectors for the development, for the farming, for the agriculture producing, to improve the standards and also benefit from that. They are going to create more jobs and taxes for these countries.
And given the current global trade protectionism and major power competition, Dr. Zhou Mi, how will China's large-scale zero-tariff measures for Africa reshape the China-Africa economic and trade landscape?
Well, I think that this trade is just one important part for the economic relations. Based on the trade, the countries are able to make a better use of their resources and endowment, and that will create many new jobs and also improve their status in the industries. Many countries are going to have a better, industrialization. It is one of their targets, and it is also one of our experiences in the previous decades. So based on that, China's huge, super large domestic market, I think that African countries can benefit from more exports to China, and they have more resources to allocate for different usage domestically or import from other countries. And the second, I think that the abilities to, the mechanism or governance is really very important for African countries. For Africa, many African countries are not have good enough performance on these governance issues, on the administrations of the customs, on different ways of managing the economy in a sustainable way. So based on this trade relation with China, they are able to do that.
That was Dr. Zhou Mi, Senior Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, talking with my colleague Zhao Yang. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back after a short break. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Iran has rejected the latest U.S. ceasefire proposal as tantamount to surrender, while U.S. President Donald Trump has described Tehran's response as totally unacceptable. Iran has put forward a new draft proposal for talks with the United States, calling for immediate end to hostilities and the lifting of U.S. sanctions. Iranian media has reported that the proposal is urging a halt to conflict on all fronts, guarantees against the future aggression against Iran, and the lifting of sanctions, including restrictions on oil sales from Iran. The plan is also calling for a 30-day timeline to roll back sanctions and release frozen Iranian assets following any preliminary agreement. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies with Fudan University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So it is reported that the peace proposal presented by the U.S. consists of a 14-point memorandum of understanding that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz while setting a framework for future nuclear talks. The U.S. parameters for nuclear talks included a moratorium on Iranian nuclear enrichment for up to 20 years, the transfer overseas of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and the dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities. Why do you think this proposal has been rejected by the Iranian side?
Well, in fact, Iran has not outright rejected the entire framework, but instead it has delivered a counter-proposal that Trump publicly dismissed as totally unacceptable. Well, I think the core reason here is that there is a fundamental difference between Iran and the United States regarding Iran's nuclear program, which Tehran views as a sovereign right under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Now, for Iran, it has incurred significant sunk costs on its nuclear program because, as we know, for many years, it maintained a relatively hardline stance. And because of that, it has already endured pressure from the United States economic sanctions. So it has already gone over a lot of difficulties. And right now, in its conflict with the United States and Israel, Iran always claims victory domestically and is unwilling to completely relinquish its nuclear capabilities, as doing so could lead to a significant decline in public support for the Revolutionary Guard.
Do you think the new draft proposal put forward by the Iranian side could be accepted by the U.S. and, for that matter, the Israeli side?
Well, I think that is really hard. Iran prioritizes ending the war and restoring its economic sovereignty, and it calls for the United States to relieve its sanctions on Iran's economy. And at the same time, Iran wants to push nuclear talks into a later phase, and it tries to preserve its enrichment capabilities. Because for Iran, it fears that if it makes considerable concessions on the nuclear issue, then the United States might escalate the conflict after that. So it has always refused to compromise on this issue at this stage. But for Trump, he has already stated that his red lines include no enrichment for high level enrichment of uranium removal, and also no control over the strait. So I think right now it might be hard for Washington to accept it in current form. Trump has already called it unacceptable, and United States negotiators also insist that the nuclear issue must be addressed at right now.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned that the war would continue as long as Iran had a stockpile of highly enriched uranium. But on this particular issue, regarding highly enriched uranium, Trump appears to take a more relaxed view. If we take a look at some of his recent media interview taken by the U.S. leader, and it is reported that Trump has been presented with the military option for seizing the highly enriched uranium. Do you think that's a viable option for Washington?
Well, I think obviously, like you said, there are disagreements between Israel and the United States. So Netanyahu's stance is very much hardline and uncompromising. Trump appears to be more pragmatic, and he's still pursuing diplomacy and has been briefed on military options. But I think it has not ruled out force if talks collapse. Right now, this kind of plan of seizing the highly enriched uranium could be very hard and challenging because there are a lot of operational hurdles. Much of the highly enriched uranium is stored in deep fortified underground facilities in Fordo and Natanz, for instance, and conventional bombing cannot guarantee destruction. Also, a ground raid to seize cylinders would also require special operation forces operating deep inside Iran, which could be highly risky. Also, if you do that, it would almost certainly shatter the ceasefire and reignite full-scale conflict. And there could be a lot of spillover effects, including the rise of oil price further. So overall, I think for the United States, the plan does not seem to be feasible. And if the plan is implemented, it will definitely bring huge costs and risks.
We understand Russia has actually proposed taking enriched uranium from Iran to help negotiate a settlement. And on Saturday, I think President Vladimir Putin of Russia reaffirmed that that proposal from Moscow remains on the table. Do you think the U.S. and Israel are willing to see such a scenario?
Well, it is reported that, in fact, the United States previously rejected similar ideas. Currently, my observation is that neither the United States nor Israel is likely to accept it. For the United States, Trump administration insists on direct U.S. control or verified destruction instead of storage in Russia. And one important reason is that Russia has always been a very strong ally of Iran, and the United States does not have enough trust on Russia. And as for Israel, Netanyahu explicitly wants the material taken out of Iran by force if necessary, and has always insisted that it does not accept the uranium to be relocated to a third country where it could theoretically be returned later. And also, if Russia plays any very important role in this issue, then it means that it could empower Russia as a nuclear intermediary. And that would give Moscow leverage over both the United States and the region of the Middle East, which neither side of the United States and Israel wants to see.
On Sunday, the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait reported drone incursions in their airspace, and on a ship on the coast of Qatar, another drone attack started a small fire. What do you think these latest developments tell us briefly?
Right. I think it seems that these attacks aim to remind the Gulf states and the United States that Hormuz and regional shipping remain vulnerable. And I think a very important context is that the UAE's recent withdrawal from OPEC has prompted many OPEC members to announce the intention to increase oil production. But if that happens, then it means that maybe the international oil price could decrease to a certain extent. And right now we see Iran and the Gulf states are currently engaged in a price negotiation. So in general, I think the tension between the Gulf states and Iran, is demonstrated in this kind of conflict. And if that kind of instability persists, then it means that oil price, could fluctuate further.
Thank you very much for joining us and for your analysis. Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Fudan University. Coming up, Brazil grants visa-free entry for Chinese passport holders. This is World Today. We'll be back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Chinese citizens holding ordinary passports can now travel to Brazil visa-free. Under a newly introduced measure, Chinese passport holders may enter Brazil for tourism, business, transit, or to participate in artistic and sporting events for stays of up to 30 days. Brazilian authorities say the measure is aimed at strengthening cultural exchange, tourism cooperation, and economic engagement. The move is also based on reciprocity after China previously granted visa-free entry to Brazilian citizens for short-term stays. So for more, my colleague Xu Yawen spoke with Dr. Yao Shujie, Chang Kong Professor of Economics with Chongqing University.
Professor Yao, after Brazil announced this visa-free policy for holders of Chinese ordinary passports, data from several Chinese travel platforms showed a surge in interest in travel to Brazil. What does this sharp increase in travel searches tell us about how ordinary Chinese people perceive Brazil?
Ordinarily, Chinese people tends to visit the European countries, America, Japan, Southeast Asia. But one of the most attractive tourism place is actually Brazil. Brazil have a very long history, have lots of beautiful sceneries, beautiful city like Rio de Janeiro, full of cultural activities and beautiful seashores. Now, Brazil is also one of the biggest country in the world in terms of territory, in terms of population, which is well over 200 million people. So Brazil by nature actually have a very strong attractions, not only for the Chinese tourists, but it's also very attractive for many Western countries which high income and people have a high affordability to go there to spend time and enjoy the beautiful place. Since the opening of the Chinese policy, especially after the international complication with the United States, China development focus is highly, focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative country, especially in Latin America, where Brazil is the biggest country in terms of population, in terms of GDP, and in terms of cultural richness. So the Chinese investors, especially Chinese major companies, they have a very strong interest of setting a foot in the soil to establish their company and subsidiary, especially, for example, like BRD, one of the biggest, car manufacturer in the world and the biggest in China, is already setting up a branch in Brazil to penetrate the new vehicles into, the foreign market, especially in Latin America, which is highly successful. Another way is that Brazil by nature is also have a lots of commodities that are needed by the Chinese, market. For example, like materials, like agricultural produce. This give a very obvious complementarity in terms of bilateral economic development and trade, as well as investment. The subsequence of this trade and investment link is that tourism will become also very important. Tourism belongs to the international services. And there is an expanding Chinese middle class who are able to spend money for sightseeing in a foreign country, to learn foreign experience and get the cultural experiences. So I think by opening up the gate, especially the Brazilian government is willing to accept the Chinese tourists without a visa. That would actually open a very, very strong channels for the Chinese middle class to go there and see the beautiful country.
Professor, speaking of trade, a recent report by Brazil-China Business Council shows that Brazil reclaimed the top spot globally for Chinese outbound investment in 2025, attracting 10.9% of total Chinese outbound capital, compared with 6.8% for the United States and 5.7% for Guyana. What do you make of Brazil becoming China's top global investment destination? Is that a surprise to you?
It is surprise or not surprise. It is surprise because normally we expect that the Chinese investment will go into the neighboring countries in Southeast Asia and the biggest economy of America, like America. But it's not surprising in a sense that because China and Brazil have a very strong complementarity, as I just mentioned, not only for the technology and commodity chain, but also for the expertise and also the new emerging technology like new vehicles, like AI, like digital, cross-border services and commodity, trade. So China invested in Brazil. China require a lot of mineral, especially the iron ore. In Brazil, as one of the three biggest exporting company of iron ore. The company provided a huge amount of iron ore to the Chinese largest steel maker industry. And the Chinese multinational company, especially the Chinese big company in the mining sector, they established their own branches, and even they bought mine and produce product in Brazil. The second thing is that Brazil government is highly friendly to the Chinese government. The government-to-government relationship set the very solid political and diplomatic foundations for these kinds of business and investment expansion. The third reason is that because in the American continents, North America and South America, although they are very close, but the United States have always made these kinds of unilateralism and protectionist, and even to some extent highly antagonized to some of the southern countries in Latin America. This, to some extent, puts them away toward Eastern business giant, that is China. So I'm very pleased to see these kinds of bilateral link. Hope that the distance is not going to become a matter. The distance is going to become, to reduce, as people are willing to reduce the physical distance and the mental distance for the two countries to cooperate and work together to produce benefit for the two people and the prosperity for the two countries.
Brazil, as you mentioned, is the largest economy in Latin America, and with this visa-free policy for Chinese citizens now in effect, do you believe this move to facilitate people-to-people exchanges could set a benchmark for other South American countries? Also, like how might Brazil's decision influence the overall trend of South American countries opening up further to China in areas such as trade, investment, tourism?
Yeah, Brazil is a leading nation, as I mentioned, not only the biggest economy power in Latin America, but it's also a very influential political and diplomatic power also. The action by Brazil to have a closer relationship with China will certainly have a demonstrating effect on the neighborhood. And neighborhood in Latin America also have a very strong potential for further economy and international trade development. And this kind of development is mutually beneficial, it's inclusive, it's good for the people in Latin America and China. I'm sure there will be a lot of other countries will follow the footstep of Brazil as the opening is the right direction. In the past, people may not have too much mutual trust, but nowadays, because of the economy, business, and diplomatic linkage, they actually bring about these kinds of close connectivity. I'm sure it's not just for international trade, but also for bilateral investment and also people-to-people's exchange. These are highly integrated. Trade is not decoupled from investment. Investment is not decoupled from people-to-people exchange. And trade investment would also not decouple with tourism. Every activity is going to create jobs, to create economic income, to create mutual understanding and common prosperity. So it is a very positive step forward.
Dr. Yao Shujie, Changkong Professor of Economics with Chongqing University, speaking with my colleague Xu Yawen. Coming up, Keir Starmer's party lost big in Britain's local elections. This is World Today. Stay tuned. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has insisted that he will not resign after his governing Labour Party suffered huge losses in the country's regional elections. About 5,000 seats were up for grabs across more than 130 council elections. The Labour Party lost more than 1,100 seats that it previously held. In the meantime, the far-right Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, has made significant gains. Other political groups, especially the left-wing Green Party, also recorded notable wins. The elections were widely seen as an unofficial referendum on Starmer. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Kamal Makili Aliyev, Associate Professor at the School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, what do you make of the main reasons behind the Labour Party's huge losses in the elections?
Well, I think the main issue is that many voters expected some visible change and much faster after the Labour Party came to power. Instead, there is still a lot of frustration over living costs, public services, migration, and broader sense of economic stagnation. At the same time, Keir Starmer built his image around this kind of competence and stability as a politician, but that can come or become politically difficult if voters do not feel concrete improvements in daily life. So Labour Party is going to be losing support, and it's also now losing support in multiple directions and all at once, both to the Reform UK party on the right and to the Greens party on the left. So this in itself is not one single protest vote. It reflects a wider dissatisfaction with the political establishment in the UK and with the pace of change.
What do you make of the significant gains made by Nigel Farage's Reform UK party? Is it because the party benefited tremendously from this kind of voter dissatisfaction with the Labour Party and, for that matter, with the Conservative Party as well, or because of other factors?
Well, yes, Nigel Farage and the Reform UK party, they benefited majorly from the dissatisfaction with both Labour and the Conservatives. So this needs to be pointed out. This was, they drawn the votes from both parties. But there is something deeper happening politically, I think. Because Farage, he has positioned himself as an anti-establishment figure. And when he's speaking to the voters who feel ignored on migration, identity, and this is very huge right now in politics in the UK, and even economic insecurity, which is also rising. So what makes Reform UK party so dangerous for the mainstream parties is that it's no longer just a protest movement, right? It's not just, this kind of a mass mobilization with very little political baggage and credibility. On the contrary, it's becoming a structurally disruptive force in the British politics. Structurally disruptive, that means that it can actually challenge this Labour-Conservative balance that have been there for ages. And this fits a wider European trend where populist and anti-establishment parties are gaining ground because traditional centrist politics is losing public trust.
So what do you expect Prime Minister Keir Starmer to do to try to reverse his declining popularity? Is it even possible to do that? To reverse this trend?
I think that's a great question. I also think that Starmer will likely focus on delivery or what he can deliver politically and in terms of, social well-being rather than on ideology. So trying to show economic stability, improvement in public services, and tighter messaging on immigration and security instead of going for the ideological, preaching. I think the challenge is timing. And it's very important here because in UK, the governments, they are judged very quickly. But economic recovery and institutional reform takes much longer time, especially if you're talking about such a machine as the United Kingdom. There are these kind of forces there that are very inert and that are very static rather than dynamic. And to reverse the trends, you need time. So yes, I think theoretically the trend can be reversed, but only if voters begin to feel tangible improvements and quickly. At the moment, Labour is still has a little bit of time politically, but the pressure inside the party is also clearly growing. So there is a tension there.
I see. So as you were indicating this point earlier, we know traditionally the politics in Britain have been a largely two-party system, the Labour and the Conservatives. Now, do you think it is fair to say that the political landscape in this country has profoundly, changed?
I think Britain is certainly entering a more fragmented political era, even if the electoral system still favors these large parties, right? But this old Labour conservative dominance is weakening because voter loyalties are weaker than before, not as tight around the polls as they have been. So the politics is increasingly shaped by the identity, culture, regional divides, and distrust of mainstream institutions. What we're seeing now looks more like a continental European politics, multiple parties competing for fragmented electorates rather than two dominant blocs controlling the system totally. So structurally, yes, British politics is becoming more volatile and more pluralized. I acknowledge the trend.
So, by the way, do you think Nigel Farage, who we know was a central figure when we talk about the Brexit movement many years ago, do you think he is likely to become the Prime Minister of the UK following the country's next general elections?
At this stage, it is unlikely, I would say, mainly because the British electoral system makes it difficult for insurgent parties to win outright parliamentary majorities. So there are difficulties built within the system. But Farage's influence should not be underestimated. He has already reshaped British politics once through the Brexit without ever becoming prime minister, which is, a very huge achievement, if not the best for the country. The more immediate question is whether Reform UK can permanently replace the Conservative Party as the dominant force of the right. And if that happens, then British politics going to change fundamentally. So a Farage premiership is not most likely scenario today, but it is no longer politically unthinkable as it used to be before. And that alone should tell you how much the political landscape have shifted in the United Kingdom. Very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Kamal Makili Aliyev, Associate Professor joining us from the School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg. Unfortunately, that's all the time for this edition of World Today. A quick recap of today's headlines. China has confirmed an upcoming state visit by U.S. President Donald Trump. China's exports and imports set records in April despite high energy costs. And President Donald Trump calls Iran's response to his peace plan totally unacceptable. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching for World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.